In our gospel lesson this morning, a lawyer, a man who is a lawyer, asks Jesus a question. And the gospel says he does this to test Jesus. He says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus replies with a question to the lawyer. "Well, what does it say in the Jewish law?" The lawyer responds, "It says that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus says, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But the lawyer is not satisfied with Jesus' answer, and still wanting to test Jesus, he asks, "And who is my neighbor?" That is, where do the boundaries of my responsibilities to others lie? With that knowledge in hand, the man can be assured that his action or his inaction is in accordance with his beliefs and his religious law. Neither his heart, nor his mind, nor his faith will be stretched, as long as he knows and can clearly see where the boundaries lie in caring for his neighbor. And Jesus replies to this man's question of who is my neighbor with a teaching story, a parable. I won't go through the whole story again, of course, but a few things to note that are interesting in this story, I think. Jesus says there was a man who went from Jerusalem to Jericho. The road the man was traveling on from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously known as a dangerous road. Jerusalem is a high place. It is about 2,300 feet above sea level. And Jericho is a low place. It is near the Dead Sea, which is 1,300 feet below sea level. So in a short span of maybe 20 miles, this very narrow, winding road drops about 3,600 feet through very steep and rocky terrain. And as such, it was an excellent place for thieves to set up an ambush. They could make attacks on travelers who were traveling along this narrow, long descent, and then escape into the surrounding rocks where they would not get caught. For centuries, this road was known as the Bloody Way, also the Jericho Road, due to the frequency of attacks. Jesus' parable describes the type of violence that was constantly happening on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho for hundreds of years. This setting would have been very familiar to the lawyer and to any others who were hearing Jesus speak this story. The man, of course, traveling the Jericho Road, the Bloody Way, encounters tragedy. He is stripped, beaten, robbed, and left for dead upon the side of the road. Two men, a priest and a Levite, very religious men, come upon the man, cross to the other side of the road to avoid him. Why would they do that? Well, because their religious viewpoints told them not to go near the man because he was near death and as such would have been unclean. And also because he was an outsider in terms of his race and his creed. A third man comes along, the man on the side of the road, and he is a Samaritan. And this is important in the story because a Samaritan would have been a person who was cast out of the general population, almost, of the days of Jesus. He would have been a person of cast out race and creed. He, of course, takes care of the man, nurses his wounds, places him on an animal, takes him to an inn, gives the innkeeper a blank check, and says, "Take care of him, nurse him back to health." Which of these three, Jesus asked, do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The lawyer answers again, the man who showed mercy. Again, Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." Now, this is a very familiar story to us, and it's easy to overlook some of the things that we hear and read all the time in this story. Did you notice in the reading that the man asked this question, "Who is my neighbor?" The man asks, "Who as my neighbor?" And Jesus focuses on being a good neighbor. Who do you think was the neighbor? The man's emphasis, the lawyer's emphasis, is on defining who is and who is not his neighbor. And Jesus' emphasis is on being a good neighbor, not on determining and defining and making boundaries about who is in and who is out. The man testing Jesus wants to know where his boundaries lie in caring for others because he is acting from a place of scarcity and fear. Now, I don't know about you, but I can attest that I've acted from a place of scarcity and fear in my life, not wanting to get too involved, not wanting to give too much. Yep, scarcity and fear. Whereas, on the other hand, the Samaritan is acting from a place of courage and life and abundance. The Samaritan is not concerned with defining who his neighbor is and isn't. He is more taken with the idea of how he can be a good neighbor. And in this lies the moral of this story. When we neighbor, when we love, when we care for others out of fear, our neighborhood, our world, and even our hearts grow smaller. The news this week has reminded us all too clearly that our fears can serve to protect us, but they can also cause us and others great harm. When we nurture the fears that are present within us, rather than our courage, we are led down pathways of blame, mistrust, and despair, from which no one benefits. As you know, our family had the opportunity to spend the better part of this past week in Yosemite, California. During our stay, we had a chance to hike some of the trails that wind their way through this beautiful valley. And on our first day, looking at the map, the trail map, the four of us, I quickly reminded my family, you know, I'm afraid of heights and confined, narrow spaces. And I'm looking at this beautiful valley thinking, there's neither of those, right? Wide open spaces, there's no confined, narrow spaces that I need to be concerned about, or heights. And fortunately, there were a number of trails that were quite tame. But of course, the tame trails don't take you up to see waterfalls. The tame trails don't take you out on scenic points from which you can see God's entire beautiful creation. Looking at the map and reading the faces of my family, I could see that the trail that they most wanted to hike would entail both heights and narrow, confined spaces. Having spent quite a few times at amusement parks, sitting on the bench while the rest of my family goes on, the valley of fear, I knew exactly immediately that I would have a choice to make. What if I never get back to Yosemite Valley? Am I going to regret not having climbed this mountain? Am I going to regret not having hiked this trail with my family? Because I could see by the looks on their faces that they needed to go, and I was going to be left behind in the trailhead gift shop. Of course, I chose the trail with much encouragement from them. The trail to Vernal Falls is marked strenuous, not so much because it is long, but because it is a constant and progressive incline on mountainous terrain. The final 15 minutes of the trail is marked by a very steep climb up a narrow rocky path, and it crests at the top of a 317-foot waterfall. I think there's a picture. This is the last 15 minutes. Yep, my palms are sweaty. And as we hiked along this amazing path, I couldn't help but notice a few things. That it was a very well-trod path, walked by hundreds of hikers before me and after me, many of whom looked a whole lot like me and my family, and most of whom looked nothing like us at all. It was not long before our four voices joined in this chorus of languages, being spoken, I realized, from all over the globe. We were on the same trail with people of all ages and races, creeds and languages and abilities, each one encouraged to go at their own pace. When it was apparent that someone on this trail was struggling, we stopped to make room. We sought to give a hand. As we made our way up this steep, narrow incline, we stopped, because it's a one-person path, to make room for mothers cradling children on their hips. We stopped to make room for elderly gentlemen and women who were climbing with every breath with these 2 walking sticks, taking their time because they knew they had to do it. And hikers, then we made room for people like me, who had to stop and catch their breath, stop and take extra drinks of water to ward off altitude sickness. At one point on the journey, though I was usually cradled somewhere in the midst of my family, sometimes I was at the end, at one point I was at the front of our family of 4. I was feeling quite confident at this point before we got here. And at one point I was leading our family when I stopped to catch my breath and have a drink of water. A woman had stopped to take a break on the trail also at this point, and I needed to either step around her or sit down on the rock with her and take a break. She saw me struggling somewhat, and she patted the rock next to her, slid over, and said, "Have a seat." "I can't," I said. "My family's coming up behind me. I gotta keep going." She said, "Oh, just sit down. Wave to them as they pass you by. That's okay." And it was like that all the way. Hikers on their way coming down this path, patting us on the shoulders, giving us encouraging words. "You can do it. Wait till you get to the top. It's breathtaking." And on the way down, I thought to myself, if I had only listened to my fear, I would have missed out on this glorious view, the rush of this waterfall, the beauty of creation. But what is so much more is that I would have missed out on a much-needed reminder that people are good. People are good. And we are all really traveling the same path. We are all really trying so hard to be our best selves, to keep the faith, to care for our families, to help our fellow human beings, to serve as God would have us serve, to be the best that we could be, and to try and leave this world better for our having been here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather that the assessment that something is more important than fear. Jesus says that which is more important than fear is love. Love for God and love for our neighbor. And aren't we as Christians all traveling on the same path? And isn't our calling to remind one another on the path, you're doing well, you're doing good, keep it up, something better is coming? Who is our neighbor? Anyone who is in any need. And isn't that each and every one of us? Thanks be to God.